Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for our Furniture Detective Chairs presentation with our Chief Curator, Richard Barons. My name is Marianne Delacroix, and I'll be your moderator this evening. Richard, go ahead and begin. I will start the presentation for you.
Good. Good evening. Perfectly lovely day. Lovely day to be outside, certainly. And we had 3 chairs sent to us. And the nice thing about the chairs is that they span about a 60-year period or so. And they are, one is from the 1790s, one is from the 1830s, 1820s, and one is probably from the 1860s. And 2 of them are early factory production, and one of them is not early factory production. So I'll just give a little intro. I personally have always been very interested in chairs. I do believe it was probably because of my parents, who had bought a big old Victorian house in the early 1940s outside of Rochester. And they thought they were getting the house furnished when they bought it. Had, I think, 5 bedrooms in it. And when they arrived with the moving van with very few things of their own, they saw that there was an auction happening. And indeed, the contents of the house did not come with the house. And so therefore, they didn't have very much to move in. And there really were hardly any chairs or anything to even sit on. So a neighbor came over with a cake. And I think both my parents mentioned the problem, and they said, "Oh, you just can't trust that guy who sells houses." But he said, "There's auctions in the community every single weekend." So he said, just next Saturday, go to an auction, and for little or no money, you can furnish your house. So that became a hobby in my family. It's certainly long since have they furnished the house, but we were always going out looking for things. And I think when I was about 10 years old, they said, "Here's $10, you can spend it." I might have been a little younger, and you can buy something. And there were so many chairs at this particular house that was the first thing I bought. And so then somebody gave me a book on chairs, and I have been in reality dealing with chairs virtually my entire curatorial life. So I find them very interesting. More chairs than probably tables survive from the last 200 years. I really don't know why, but I think it's probably because, everybody can use an extra chair sometime. And it really didn't make any difference if you're having a picnic or a guest bedroom or whatever, what kind of chair you use. You might paint it white to match a white dresser if it's a summer cottage, but chairs just always seem to be usable. And you can buy an 18th century chair relatively inexpensively still, because most auctions of furniture are going to have more chairs than they will anything else. And the other thing that I find interesting about chairs is that there's always the saying about the king of the house or the queen of the house. And if you look back upon things like King Tutankhamun's tomb and his magnificent throne, there has been, people have associated sentimentally personifications about chairs. Our historical society has a number of chairs that have labels on the back of them or on the seat or wherever they could stick it that says, my favorite is, "This belonged to my uncle, given to me by my aunt, don't sell." So, I mean, we have no information on that chair whatsoever. She could have at least told us what the name of her aunt was. But we also have an extraordinary chair that belonged to Reverend Buell, made in New York in the 1780s, top-notch Windsor chair. That was so important that a engraved brass tablet was screwed onto the seat of the chair to guarantee that no one would ever sit in the chair again unless they wanted to be uncomfortable. And they'd always know that this is the chair that Reverend Buell sat at. And the interesting thing is when we got the chair, we also acquired a full-length portrait painted in the 1780s of Dr. Buell sitting in the chair, that very exact same chair. We have a number of chairs that belong to important people, even some less important people, like a well-known, well, not a well-known, but one of the architect of Guild Hall. We had a chair that he sat in when he was working at his drafting table. And one of the chairs we're going to look at tonight is startling because it has almost a complete genealogy on the back of it. So we recently also acquired for the Historical Society, with the benefit of deep pockets from a number of our members and friends, a very important chair, which belonged to Lyman Beecher, and it was the chair he used to write his sermons in. And since he was apprenticed to his dad, who was a blacksmith when he was a young man, he wanted an extra part of his writing armchair to hold a Bible. So when he was working on the sermons, he'd have the Bible right out in front of him. And so he made a wrought iron handle and attached it to a bookshelf. And so that is something that he put on to even make his chair more personal. And then to make the chair even more personal, on the bottom of it is a shipping label from Cincinnati to New York from the last parish he worked at. And this is a shipping label which went on the train when the chair left Ohio and came back to New York. And then it was lost until it was rediscovered about 2 years ago, and the Historical Society obtained it. So chairs have a lot of personality. And we're going to look at our first chair, which is the oldest chair in our grouping. This is what's commonly called a Windsor chair, probably because a lot of engravings in the late 18th century of country farmhouses in England show chairs that are somewhat like this. What makes them unusual is that they're very light. There's not a lot of wood in them, and they're very, very strong. The seats are usually made out of a plank. In this instance, this one, which was made about 1795 in Lisbon, Connecticut, by Ebenezer Tracy Sr. It's a carved seat, and if you look at it, you see how it has been shaped? Collectors call these saddle seats because there's a rounded area for the base of your bottom, and then there's another area that's a little higher, and then a low area for your thighs. Earlier chairs with rush seats often had areas where you could tie a cushion to them so they'd be more comfortable, but a chair like this one is surprisingly comfortable and doesn't really need a cushion. The other thing about it is that there's really no glue used in this construction of this chair. There are a few wooden pins, maybe one or two areas of glue, but very, very little glue. And the hoop or sack, which it's often called, that back that's rounded like that, is one piece of bent hickory. These chairs were almost always painted because they were 4 or 5 different types of wood. You've got hickory, the spindles, which are shaped, very carefully shaped. You'll notice that they're not just a round dowel, they're shaped. Those are usually made out of hickory or sometimes ash. The seat is pine, and the legs are turned maple. So you get, and maple's a very strong wood, so therefore it's very good for chairs. So if they run back and forth, rub on a floor, they're not going to really wear down. A pine seat, I know it sounds silly because it's wood, but honestly, a soft pine seat is more comfortable than an oak seat, which has no give whatsoever. And notice how thin the legs are. And notice how the legs are turned to look like a very fancy wood that recently had been introduced to Europe, in particular France and England. And that was bamboo, which came from sometimes India, sometimes China, sometimes some of the other Asian countries. It was originally very valuable because it was imported. So it was used for little boxes and things. And chair turners, to make their things look a little special, would often turn the legs to look like they were made out of bamboo. And that's a typical turning you find on Windsor chairs made after 1790. Before that time, the chair turnings are much bolder. There are 3 stretchers, an H stretcher that holds these legs in place. So you can move in and away from your desk or dining room table or, the bar, wherever you might be sitting in this chair. And those stretchers, 2 stretchers on each side that go between the front legs and the back leg, they're doweled in. And then there's a central one to hold it even tighter. And then these legs, the bottom underside of the seat is drilled. So the end of the leg goes into a hole in the seat. Sometimes it comes all the way through. And all of those little spindles, which support that sack back from falling or breaking or whatever, all of those are in fact they all pin into either the bent wood or into the seat frame. The legs in the back splay backwards, the legs in the front splay out, meaning that it's not a chair that's very easy to tip over in, and so certainly that made it very useful. And one person who wrote an article about Windsor chairs many, many years ago in the 1930s in the magazine Antiques said that he really did not believe that people should use the word reproduction when it comes to a Windsor chair. And he waited silently and then answered his question. Why did he say that? He says, because really, when Windsor chairs originally were made, they have never not been made since. And I remember as a kid, many years ago, at the Eastman Theater in New York with the Eastman Philharmonic, that as kids, we were allowed to go up during school tours and visit with the members of the orchestra. And sometimes they let us sit in their chairs. And their chairs all looked like they were wooden Windsor chairs. But those chairs were all steel and were grain painted to look like oak. So those chairs would last forever. And I know every once in a while one will show up at an auction in upstate New York, and people always call them the George Eastman chairs. Now this chair has a sort of a mysterious background. We don't know very much about it. All we know is that a friend of mine bought it for not very much money, probably maybe 12 years ago at the LVIS. And I got a phone call from them saying that they thought that this was a very old chair. And since they knew that my office was right next door, that I'd certainly come over and tell them. And there were 2 of them. There was a pair of them, one that was stripped and the other that was in the original dark green. They were both the same price. And she said, I only need one. What one should I buy? I said, well, if you're buying it for beauty and investment and antiquarian interest, you're going to buy the one with the original finish. Because so many Windsor chairs have survived over the years, have been refinished or repainted or redecorated. And this one was pretty amazing because in fact, it had not been, the finish was the original finish on it. And it'd be fun to know, which you'll never know.
Almost missed this program that
Where it came from.
Richard, hold on, please, hold on. We're just going to ask them as you're coming in to please mute yourself. Thank you.
I had this program that I was going to join on the computer. I forgot about it until now.
We can hear you. You just ask that as you come in, please mute yourself. Okay, go ahead, Richard.
Anyway, we really don't know where this came from. We don't know if it came from the original family here, although it easily could have. These chairs were mass produced in a factory with all handwork and probably no more than a master, his son, and 2 apprentices in Lisbon, Connecticut. And these were so popular, these chairs, that a lot of the chairs were made for export. And I remember being in Eleuthera many years ago and being in a cottage there. And in that cottage, there were 2 matching chairs to this one, which had descended in an Eleutheran family. And because these were sent off to the West Indies, you could stack them up in the hold of the ship, they wouldn't break. And so there was a big business on seaports with, chair makers. We always think that chair makers in the 18th century, everything was custom made, it was just for you. If you had a big bottom, you could have a bigger chair. Well, there's some truth to that, but also a chair like a Windsor chair that was popular, you could make 150 of them, over a year and then sell them in Newport or New London, and then they would be shipped off to the West Indies. And every once in a while, some of these will come back from the West Indies, and they have an interesting story to them. So this is a classic Windsor chair. It's very delicate. It's very beautiful. You can see why some design museums have a Windsor chair, one or two in their collection. Some collections of chairs, like the Garvin collection at Yale, probably has 75 Windsor chairs that you can look at. And for collectors of Windsor chairs, because there are certain aspects that make this a chair by Tracy, whether it's branded or not, and sometimes these chairs were branded by the makers on the bottom of the seat usually, there are enough of them around, and that so many collectors collect them that there's probably more books on Windsor chairs for collectors. One book that came out from Windsor Tour is 3.5 inches wide. And I remember about a month ago when I was doing some research and fell asleep, I got woken up immediately when the book fell on my face because it was so heavy. But lots of interest in Windsor chairs. And we have a good sized collection of Windsor chairs. If you want to examine them, just give us a call at the Historical Society, or in reality, probably much easier to go on our website and just leave a message or an email. And, we will be opening up the Mulford Farm when on availability, if you give us a warning, and you can spend some time and really, you could get a high quality class in Windsor chairs and later chairs at the Mulford Farm. So let's go on to our next chair. Now our next chair has this amazing label on it. And it's very interesting. I love furniture that has labels on them. Sometimes they're not correct, but they're always interesting. So this one says pretty much that was the property of a family in Lee, Maine. And it says the chair was brought to what is now called Lee, Maine, by Purchase Lee when he came there on his ox team from Pittston, Maine, before Lee was incorporated. And that's when it was named Lee. He was one of 4 brothers, and he died in 1867. And his widow, Eliza, returned to Pittston, but she gave several of the chairs to her relatives. And this is the chair that was given to Nathan Lee. And it's got this number 47 on it, and it says property of. So it's very unusual to have such a succinct inventory. It certainly doesn't imply that this is being done, by someone who's appraising an estate. It's obviously someone who wants to be very careful and has a big family and wants to make sure that every single member of the family, gets one of the artifacts. Let's take a look at the chair that this label is on. Now, the chair is what's sometimes called a kitchen Windsor. Sometimes it's called a rabbit-eared Windsor. Sometimes it's called a plank back Windsor. So in other words, there's lots of different names. Some of them have some historical background. You might find them in the day book of a chairmaker. And chairmakers were often just chairmakers. Many chairmakers did not make cabinet work at all. They were turners, and that's really what they did. They might have made a table and chairs, but they normally would not have made a chest of drawers unless they were in a smaller community and they were really it. They were the only one who could make furniture. So when this chair was made, it was originally painted. We really don't know what the color was, but this has an amazing patina. It has been used and used and used. When it was originally created, it may have been a dining chair. It also could have been part of a parlor set of chairs and maybe a Windsor bench or something of that nature. Why would it be called a rabbit ear chair? Well, it doesn't make a lot of sense until you look at it. And if you look at the styles, those are the 2 rounded, flattened side rails that on either side of the spindles on the back. And the style goes into the seat, just like it did in the Windsor chair that we saw before, that certainly a little more formal than this one. And then because they scooped with a plane the front edge of each of the styles, that's what's often referred to for some reason by people as a rabbit's ear. It's more logical when it's pointed and it comes up above the rail, but nonetheless, that's what it's usually called. The seat has been carved out, but you certainly wouldn't call it a saddle seat. It doesn't have all of the sculptural shaping that we saw in the Tracy chair. And this one we have really no idea who made it. I quickly went to some of my books on Windsor chairs, and it is certainly a typical chair from Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine from 1835, 1840 to about 1860. And they were usually painted yellow or red and black grained to look like rosewood. Some of them, those are the most desirable, are painted yellow. And since yellow is a color that fades and dirties easily, there aren't a lot of pieces of furniture that survive that are bright yellow any longer, which is one of the reasons it's a premium color for collectors of painted furniture and folk art. This chair would be sort of a folk art chair. And that back splat back there, that flat panel, was probably freehand painted with flowers or roses or seashells or something of that nature. And there would probably, to make the legs look as though they were turned like bamboo, the decorator would put little green lines around them to make it look like it was a bamboo chair. I think we have another photograph of this chair. So here you can see the shaping and the rake of the back. I'm sure you've read stories and heard about people not, sitting straight up when they ate dinner. Well, you didn't really have much choice in the matter in a chair like this. Yes, certainly you could lean back on it for a few moments, but your lap would certainly be a benevolent recipient of some soup or food, if so. So most chairs were designed, yes, they could be used, you could lean them up against the wall, but if they were a dining room chair, you were sitting straight up. That was no question about it. The seat is sort of scrolled in the front. It's higher in the front. It sort of scrolls down for the bottom, and then it scrolls up a little. There's a little shaping. It's all been carved out of a single chunk of pine. And this chair, like the one that's painted, the one that we saw before, the Tracy, would have been painted in a regular base color, such as I said, red or black or yellow are the three most popular colors. So you wouldn't have been aware of the different tones in the wood itself. Now, you'll also notice that the spindles here are shaped. So they're shaped, and very much bent in a steaming process to match up with the bent shaping of the style. And that plank top is then screwed to the flat part of the style. This is a charming chair. Many people today would look at it and they would say it's a primitive chair, but in reality, it was all decorated. It was not a primitive chair at all. It was a fancy chair, and decorated chairs were called fancy chairs simply because there was more money and time spent on ornamenting them. So over the years, the paint probably just wore off, and you can see traces of the original undercoat of red showing up just in a few places on the chair. And you can see how very nice and simple the stretchers are. So this would be a modified, simple Windsor chair. And that's why today collectors tend to call them kitchen chairs. And I would say that it was probably made in the 1840s. So it was already an heirloom in the 1860s when Mr. Lee died. And it's so wonderful to think that this chair was like King Tut's tomb after all, and was so important in the family. It has a number and a whole story on the bottom of it, to tell everybody whoever picks it up and looks at the underside, the whole story of who owned this chair. And of course, to people buying things in the 19th century, I mean, they could care if they bought it from Tracy or Dominy or whoever. They were just buying things from chair makers who had a good reputation. And that was the interesting thing about small communities with the craft tradition, because if you weren't a very good chair maker, how long do you think you'd survive selling chairs in East Hampton? Not very long. So you'd have to change whatever your job was. I read a diary the other day from a potter in Maine, who started out wanting to be a cabinet maker and went to 3 different communities and tried to open cabinet shops. And his furniture always fell apart. So he moved on, and he finally met a potter, and the potter introduced him to throwing on the potter's wheel. So he became a potter. So in other words, craftspeople could sort of switch around. But isn't this amazing that this little chair, just like the one before, has been with us, for over 100 years? I mean, it's really pretty astonishing. And this one just shows so much tender love and care because of its use. Whereas the other one with its old green paint, who knows, maybe people didn't like the green and the chair wasn't used very often, or it ended up in a bedroom where people sat on it only when they were putting their shoes on. I think there's one more picture of this chair. No, there isn't. Now comes our next chair. And this is a different kind of chair. Now, the chairs that we just looked at all were made in turner shops or cabinet maker shops. We don't know who made what, but we know that that's all part of that craft tradition. And with Windsor chairs and the little kitchen Windsor chair and the sack back that we saw, a cabinet maker shop or a chair maker shop in particular was very interesting looking, because they did a lot of their work was turned on a lathe. And then some of it was carved, as you saw with the seats. So once they set up the lathe, which was it took a while, had to change blades and you had to have a template. You're certainly not going to just turn 12 spindles and then wait for somebody to order another chair from you. You'll probably spend a day or maybe a week making spindles. So on the side walls of these chair makers would be these makeshift shelves, which contained the middle spindles that were longer, the second group of spindles, which were not quite as long, and another shelf would have, or a bin would have more spindles. The chair seats would be done individually, but a lot of the turning would be done en masse. And since some of these chairs were being made expressly for local people, and others were being made to be sent off, and maybe sent off with somebody in a cart and a wagon, selling them in the next community, who really knows. The whole act of making a chair was a sort of a communal. If you had 2 or 3 people helping you all the time, and then you might have done the paint. A kid in the family might have done the paint. Here in East Hampton with the Dominies, we don't really know who painted the red color on their chairs, but we do know that one of the Farrells, one of the Montaukets, was paid for doing the rush seats. So we know that someone special came in to do the rush seats. And I know in upstate New York, where we were researching a chair factory, we found out that a painter came about once a week who happened to be 2 doors down. He was a wagon maker and striper. So he would come, if necessary, and decorate the furniture with stripes and painted flowers like he would use on his carriages. So one thing we need to always remember is that, making anything that deals with than just what you could make in your little factory, your little craft shop, that you'd be getting your screws from probably the blacksmith, you'd be getting your hinges if you made chests of drawers from a local blacksmith, you get your glass from the trading post or the dealer in Sag Harbor that was bringing in glass from Connecticut. So it takes a community, and it's always good to remember that these are not solitary things. Okay, so after the Civil War, there is a resurgence in building. There is a number of recent inventions that are developed pre-Civil War, the jigsaw and other ways, bandsaws that were perfected. So ornaments for Victorian architecture could be made massively in advance. You could order them from a catalog. So if you see 3 houses in East Hampton with the same porch posts, you can't assume that those porch posts were made locally. It's very likely that they were made in, somewhere else, came into Sag Harbor, and then, you pick them up there. So what we're looking at with this chair is what's an early Victorian chair. What is its style? Problematic. The Victorians, and it's often silly for us in America to refer to an entire era of 70 some odd years as the Victorian period. These Queen Victoria virtually had nothing to do with it whatsoever. But that's how it all sort of gets put together. And during that period, we go through some very short periods for architectural styles and design styles. We start out with the end of the Greek Revival with very neoclassical things. And then we get turned on by French Rococo with sort of sinuous curves and things. And then after the Rococo, we get very interested in French mansardic furniture. And well, not French mansardic furniture. The houses have mansard roofs, and they're from the Second Empire, Napoleon II. And that's a more Baroque style. And then we keep progressing, we change. So there's a lot of pieces of furniture that we call eclectic because it has a lot of different styles. And this was all made in a factory. This chair was made in a factory where there were probably 20, 15 workers, probably was water powered. On rare occasions, they were wind powered, but they mostly were water powered. And they would have large saws that they would saw out, like the front legs on this chair are cabrio. They're shaped in a cabrio curve, but they're flat on the sides. And, within an hour, probably 40 of them could have been made. So, you could really turn out a whole lot of chairs. And after the Civil War is the beginning of buying real suites of furniture. I mean, it was one thing to buy, 3 straight Windsor chairs, 2 armchairs, and a bench, but your chest wouldn't have been in the same style. Your candle stand wouldn't have been in the same style. Things didn't really match. That wasn't intended to match. But after the Civil War, we're really into things sort of matching. And there are whole catalogs, Meeks in New York, that are publishing illustrations. So, if you're not buying from Meeks, maybe your local cabinet factory can use those Meeks illustrations and make things just like it. This chair is similar to some things that you find in the Meeks catalog. It descended in a family here in East Hampton, and they built a house in what we would call, it's one of the few houses here that sort of had some Gothic revival lines. So it had some Gothic revival, it had some Greek revival, just like some of the houses in Sag Harbor. And this chair has a tradition of having been made in Sag Harbor, but we have no information. We've not seen any chair with the name of any of the Sag Harbor cabinet makers. But look at the splat. Do you see how it's sort of like a balustrade, or it's called a vasiform splat or an urn? It's flat, thin mahogany, and then it's veneered on the front with a beautiful piece of crotch mahogany. And when I was a kid, people used to talk about veneered furniture. So that was the cheapest thing in the world. And you really wanted solid furniture that was, all beautiful, solid mahogany. Well, this chair is almost all mahogany, but it's a lower grade mahogany. It's not a fancy mahogany. And if anyone has ever seen a saw for making veneer, in the act of making a veneer, you have to cut the veneer and then you have to shape it. It has to obviously be glued, and then it has to be finished. It really was more time consuming to do veneering than it was to have made this completely out of a cheap piece of mahogany. So don't think that veneered furniture. I think the reason people had a askance at it because Often, if it hadn't been kept in a proper place, the veneer would begin to come off. And then, of course, what do you do? How do you fix that? So the front rim of this chair is veneered. The vasiform splat is veneered, and the front facing of the back splat is veneered. The rest of the chair is mahogany. If you look up on either side between the vasiform splat, and if you look at the little shape up there, it's negative space there when it reaches the top of the chair back. Do you see how that's a little Moorish or Gothic arch? So you get neoclassical here with the vasiform splat that looks like a baluster. You get a little bit of Gothic. And then if you look at the top, this sort of scrolly look, and that's a handhold. This is either a dining room or a parlor chair. And it was intended that when it wasn't around the dining room table and when it wasn't out in the middle of the room, people sitting in it, you'd move it back against the wall. So isn't it nice that they put a little handle on it so you can move it back easily? And that's pretty standard. That's all carved. Part of it may have begun as a machine carved experience, but the finished work is all hand done. And you see how curvy and sort of vivacious that is, maybe like scurly grapes or something? That's because it's Rococo. And that is one of the French movements. And then if you look at the side legs, they're sort of spade shape in their cabrioleness. And that's a neoclassical thing. So this whole chair combines certain styles. Would have been very pretty when it was new, very shiny, a very vivid grain on it. The seat is an upholstered seat, not a wooden plank. And we call it a slip seat because you can just go underneath, give a tap to under the chair, and the whole seat comes up. There's a wooden frame. This one, in fact, even has springs in it. And so it has a nice springy seat, and you could change the upholstery. This one is done in bleached dyed horsehair. That's what the woven fabric is. And that is the original fabric for this chair. Horsehair is not comfortable. If it breaks, it's sharp. And people, if they overstuff it, you slide right off of it. But it's amazingly strong. And can you imagine this chair is from probably 1860? And here we are in 2021, and it's got the original upholstery on it. I mean, that's incredible. Also, it's incredible that it got saved. Because do you think this was a very popular style in the 1950s with collectors? Not really. Victorian goes in and out as fast. I guess it comes in and out as fast as it goes in and out. So the problem with this chair, and the reason there aren't as many of them around, is because they were not made as well as a Windsor chair. There's a few pegs, but they're not continuations of the original wood. They're just little pegs that are dowels. This chair is unusual in the fact that if you sit in this, with a little heft and you plunk down, those legs will just splay out and the entire chair will just open up like a fan and fall apart. They'll fall on the ground. So one doesn't see we have a very similar chair in our collection. And we think it's from the same set. And it has been broken so many times because people sat in it too firmly. So this is just the beginning, obviously, of what probably seems like the most onerous and boring lecture you've ever heard in your life. But it's the beginning of looking at these things, which you'll notice are all pieces of sculpture, right? They're all decorative arts. They're all pieces of sculpture. All of them had much more handwork involved with them than anything we would get at IKEA today, because the parts were all handmade after all. It was all put together. It's just that it was made much quicker because we had the benefit of the machine that could make so many more chairs. How many of these chairs existed? It's hard to say. But this was a very, very popular style. And because it involved a couple different stylistic periods of what's called the Victorian period, this would always be in keeping with around 4 or 5 different periods of American Victorian architecture. So that's a little bit about chairs. I mean, there are whole lots of other crazy things that we could look at, like the underside touching the bottom of the chair, of the seat on the plank to see if there's hand plane marks and, things that would be part of being a furniture detective if you were interested in buying and collecting, probably more so than if you had an heirloom and you were really more interested in that part of the collection. So I invite you, if you have any questions, and also remember, send us photographs, maybe some more chairs, but of tables, and we'll see if we can get back together in September and do another one of these. And who knows, without COVID on our shoulders, we may be able to do something where we can bring our pieces together, maybe to the new education barn at Mulford, maybe in the fall or who knows when, and we can do a little more talking about and touching and feeling and getting that tactility that helps us to identify the age of a chair also.
Thank you, Richard. Richard, you seem to have gone dark in your nook there. If you have any questions for Richard, you can type them in the chat box and I'll feel free to, pass them along to him. There you go. One of the questions that I had for you, when you were talking about catalogs and, people buying very similar things, and you often see that, in house after house after house. Are there any styles that were particularly popular in New England or East Hampton that then weren't popular in the rest of the state or the rest of the country? Was there something specific to this region that maybe wouldn't be surviving as much in other parts of the country if, we were doing this in,
let me just turn a light on. It's so dark.
There you go.
Yeah, it's a good question because it's not necessarily an easy one to answer, but every community where things were made in the 19th century and then in the 18th century, there usually is something that's stylistically unique. It may not be really outstanding. It may be very subtle. Here in East Hampton, we all are familiar, or most of us, with the Dominy family, but there were certainly other furniture makers here at the very same time that the Dominies were pursuing their trade. And obviously some people were more anxious to buy their chairs from Mr. Osborne or whatever, or Mr. whatever in Sag Harbor, or the two guys who were making furniture in Southampton. It does sort of turn around. Some of it comes to us because it's been, people marry into other families. But in East Hampton, I would say the thing that is most striking, certainly with the Dominies, is that they developed a almost, if it's possible to be almost unique, they developed an almost unique splat. We see it every once in a while in New England, but out here it's the splat that the Dominies used most often. Now, the bracket foot that the Dominies used on their formal pieces of chests of drawers and things that just didn't have planks going to the floor, that is a different shape than you see virtually anywhere else. And you'll find it on a blanket chest. You'll find it on an expensive chest on chest. The Dominies had an unusual foot that they used, where they had obviously seen chairs and things from Pennsylvania, which had what's called a trepid foot. And they developed their own trepid foot. And then there was another cabinet maker in East Hampton or in Southampton, who did the same kind of foot. So, but, because you can look and sort of tell, but yeah, there are some things that are, we don't find many potty chairs out here. People must have just taken advantage of a chamber pot rather than a special piece of furniture for that. Whereas in New England, you find a lot of potty chairs. It's people usually have removed that part of it and have pretended it's a wing chair, but it's not that. Of all of the things the Dominies made, they made one wing chair that happens to be in our collection. But in many other communities, in New England and Philadelphia, you would have found many, many wing chairs. So upholstered furniture was much more popular. Some people feel that because of our dampness here, that we didn't want upholstered furniture. But if you look at the houses in Salem, which are right on the harbor, they had lots of upholstered furniture. So it was either too expensive or people just didn't think it was necessary. So.
Thank you. Renee asks, is there a good overview of chair styles over the years that you would recommend as a reference for the group?
Yeah, it's written by a guy named the Bishop. I think it's like $15 on eBay, and it's called American Chairs. It's a beautifully illustrated book. He was the curator for a while, I think. Anyway, he was very involved with the American Folk Art Museum, but he wrote this wonderful book on American chairs, and it's got so many good color pictures in it, and it just somehow, it's not, it was printed about 25 years ago, and it's a really good one because it shows you, it also goes by region, and it's even more fun because it goes up to the 1950s.
Oh, neat.
Wow.
Because
Thank you.
it's important because the Windsor chair was revived in Scandinavia in fact, the Scandinavians were very big collectors of American Windsor chairs. They bought them at Sotheby's auctions and had them sent. But so a lot of people like Nakashima and other people were making chairs using Windsor chair techniques in the 1950s and 60s. So it's sort of fun to follow. As I said, they never stopped making Windsor chairs. They may look a little different, but the construction is the same.
Okay.
Thank you.
And do I know we can't give out appraisal information, but do you have any idea how much any of those chairs would have cost at the time that they were being made?
I don't really have a good sense of that. It seems to me that Tracy in Lisbon, that there is a day book, and it seems to me that they figured that the chair probably was, it was like 2 shillings or something like that, which would be now probably $150 or something like that. Yeah. I think the funny story about chairs out here is the fact that Dr. Buell, who came from Hartford, Connecticut, was looking for chairs towards the end of his life here. He was a often married person, and I think he wanted new chairs for his new bride. And he writes to his sister in Hartford and says that he really would like to order 6 chairs. And he may have ordered more afterwards, but he ordered 6 chairs. And he says in there that he can get much better quality at a much better price than if he buys local.
Well, does anybody have any other questions? Feel free to type them in the chat box. We'll give you another minute if you do. Okay. We want to thank you all for joining us and for your continued support. And thank you, Richard, for all of your detective work on these chairs and all the work that you do for the Historical Society. And as Richard mentioned, we're looking forward to perhaps repeating this program in another format, hopefully this fall. So stay tuned for information on that and all the rest of our programs and events this summer on our website, www.easthamptonhistory.org. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to email me at info@easthamptonhistory.org.
And also, just if I can mention,
Sure.
we are going to be having our outdoor antique show again this year
Yes.
after a COVID period delay. So come on over and buy an antique chair.
Buy a chair, July 16th through 18th at Alford Farm. So we hope to see you then.
Thank you, Marianne, and thanks everybody for tuning in. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Have a good
Thank
night.
you. Very, very nice. Thank you.